Hi, everyone. Okay, let me share my screen. How are we doing?
There we go. Looks good.
Oh, all right, great. I'm so excited to be here today. So today's full session title is Create Once, Share Everywhere, Structuring Content for Platforms You Don't Control or Own. And this presentation is really about a shift that a lot of content teams are already experiencing. And sometimes it's not super in your consciousness, but content is no longer staying where we publish it. It's moving across platforms and systems and devices and feeds and recommendation engines, accessibility tools and partner ecosystems, and increasingly driving AI experiences. Like we've seen all of that in the last few years, and all of this is really reinterpreting and redistributing information in ways we don't control. A lot of the content workflows still assume content lives in one place. We still plan as though a web page is the final destination, even though we should know better than that. We still build workflows around channels instead of making them adaptable. And as content ecosystems become more connected, that assumption really starts breaking down in really visible ways. And what that looks like is teams, are duplicating a lot of effort across different platforms. Content gets reformatted manually. Metadata is almost an afterthought, and governance becomes extremely inconsistent if it exists at all. So information really loses context as it's moving across systems, and people spend more time maintaining and managing content more than ever as it's changing. So what makes this especially challenging is that the platforms keep changing and they're not understanding the content in a way a human does when it looks at it. If they don't see the platform doesn't see your full narrative intent and the editorial nuance that humans provide, and even the internal conversations that you're having with your team that happens behind the work. So uh, it just sees the fields, the labels, the metadata, the hierarchy, the relationships and permissions and authorizations. And when those things are unclear or inconsistent, content becomes harder to surface. So that's where structured content becomes so important. A lot of us worked with structured content, but I think it's really important to bring our awareness. Again, this is a decades old conversation, but I think it's important to talk about structured content in modern publishing now. So through this presentation, I'll use examples from food, and I'll explain why in my next slide, and recipe content, because recipes are actually one of the clearest examples of structured content in practice. They're inherently structured, but the ideas that we'll talk about today will really apply a lot more broadly across content strategy, content design, ops, publishing systems, creator ecosystems, and platform communication overall. So the goal for today is not to turn everybody into a metadata expert, but really to think differently about what content becomes once it leaves home. So for those of you, many of you who don't know who I am, but my name is Sandy Markle, and I've spent the last decade of my career working in food tech. I worked at a food tech startup called Side Chef, where I focused on recipe content. I was the content person for the whole time. And at first, it was just me. But over time, I created, structured, and ultimately delivered that content across many different platforms and experiences with a full team. And a big part of my work was helping build and scale systems that could take a single piece of content and make it usable across different surfaces like apps, integrations, smart kitchen experiences, commerce platforms like Instacart, and different product ecosystems. But I wasn't only managing and structuring content with the platform itself. I also was building partnerships with creators and working directly with the people producing recipes and media and food media, powering those experiences. And it was really fun. So I was constantly seeing both sides of the equation, what platforms needed in order to function at scale, and also what creators were actually delivering in the real world. And that whole experience included, building shoppable recipes, especially during COVID when shoppable experiences were really important. And so now the content started connecting to the commerce. My team handled everything from taxonomy design to ingredient normalization to product matching, making sure recipes could translate into real, actionable shopping experiences instead of remaining static in the editorial experience, in the editorial content. And what I started noticing pretty quickly was that content looked great in one place, but completely broke in another. Ingredients wouldn't map in a clean way. Instructions always had to be rewritten. Metadata was super inconsistent because remember, we're taking content in one form. Maybe it's from a blog, maybe it's from a PDF, from a digital magazine, but that format didn't carry over between the systems and the new platforms that they were in. So, and a surprising amount of work became like manual cleanup. There was so much manual work, and that experience really shaped how I think about content today, and not just as a publishing entity, but as something that needs to be structured in a way that every platform can support, interpret, and reuse. So since then, through my new company, Blueberry, I've still work with both food creators and tech companies, helping bridge that gap. So I continue doing what I did all along. On one side, creators producing high quality content and trying to make it work across platforms and opportunities. And on the other side, companies building products and ecosystems that depend on that content to function properly. You may be wondering, why am I working with both groups? Because I found out through my work at the startup, these two groups are incredibly siloed, and it really shouldn't be that way. So now I get to incorporate my value system into Blueberry, where I try to bridge that gap. Uh, and one thing I've consistently seen back then and now is that when things stop scaling because the system behind it wasn't designed for how that content actually moves, uh, there's you have to do something about it because it does stop the scale. And a quick fun fact before we move forward. So while I was trying to really navigate my professional journey years ago, understanding the broader content strategy world, I was actually living in Shanghai, China. I lived there for 9 years. And right now, there's much more of a content discipline, content design, content strategy community there now. But when I was there was none. So it was a lot harder to find professional community in a way that I needed it. So I remember waking up at 6, maybe 5 a.m. in the morning before work, running to my office to join Content Strategy Seattle sessions so I can learn from the community before my coworkers got into the office. So being here and speaking to the group is really a full circle moment for me. So I'm really excited to be here. So when most people, teams think about scaling content, the first instinct is usually to create more of it. So, whether that's posts, campaigns, videos, more channels, any output. But one of the biggest shifts in my own thinking over the years has been realizing that scale is not really about volume. It's about the work you've already created the work that you've already created that can continue providing value after it's published. A lot of content today is still designed for just that immediacy, just what we need right now. A launch, a campaign, a feed, just whatever that moment in time is. It performs briefly, maybe it gets shared a few times, and then gradually disappears beneath whatever comes next. Whatever that looks like in your organization, whenever you use content, that's a lot of the cycle that's happening. And that cycle means that teams are constantly starting over. When you publish something, you promote it, you adapt it for a different channel, then the next week begins and then the process starts over. Over time, that creates a really fragile relationship between effort and impact. Teams are producing enormous amounts of work, but the work itself is not really accumulating in a meaningful way. Last month's effort had nothing to do with making the next month easier. And that's the difference between content as output and content as an asset. Before I was in content strategy and content disciplines, I was in the accounting field for 10 years. So I think about structure as an asset very deliberately. An asset continues to work after the initial publication moment. It remains understandable, it remains usable, it can adapt to new format, new platforms or new systems and new audiences without being rebuilt from scratch every single time. An asset always has value, and structure is what makes that possible. So when content is intentionally structured, when important pieces are clearly defined and labeled consistently, connected through metadata and organized in reusable ways, it really becomes easier for systems and teams to work with it over time. Search systems can understand it more clearly. Internal teams can reuse it safely. Partners can integrate it. Accessibility tools can interpret it more effectively, and new channels become easier to support because the source content is already organized for adaptability. So right now we're in an age of this new version of AI that busts through the scene through Gen AI first, and we're seeing other adaptations for it. But many of you may know, because content is structured, it's already 70% of the way there for whatever new platforms or new experiences show up. But without structure, content stays locked inside the context it was originally created for. But with structure, it becomes portable, it becomes adaptable, and that portability changes the relationship between effort and scale. So instead of rebuilding constantly, teams can start building forward. And that idea really sits at the center of everything that we're going to continue to talk about today, that structure makes good content durable. One of the biggest challenges I see with content teams that my own content team faced is that our workflows has not really fully caught up with how content actually moves through the modern ecosystem. So we tend to plan content as though we control the final experience. Like we know where this content is gonna go. And to a certain extent, that's true, but it's a very limited interpretation or understanding of what structured content should be like. We imagine like a web page, a campaign, a product flow, or a social post as the primary destination, and the content is designed around that single environment, and everything else becomes an adaptation afterwards. But content rarely stays in one place anymore. A blog post becomes a search snippet, it becomes a product description, um, and that product description may get reused in onboarding flows, partner feeds, AI summaries, support experiences. Internal documentation that you have within the team becomes customer safe facing guidance in support chats. A webinar like this one becomes clips, transcripts, summaries, a newsletter, training materials. Content is constantly moving between systems and audiences and interfaces. And every time it moves, the receiving platform has different needs. Some systems prioritize accessibility. Others prioritize brevity. Some rely on metadata. Others extract only fragments of that. Some interpret the content entirely through summaries, previews, feeds, or generative interfaces. The challenge is that many workflows still treat that reuse as something that happens after publishing instead of something designed into the content from the beginning. And that creates a lot of operational friction. So again, teams end up just doing things manually rewriting content for every channel. And important context gets totally lost during that adaptation. Metadata really becomes inconsistent, and governance, if it exists, it's extremely difficult to manage. And people spend just a large amount of time recreating information that technically already exists someplace else. And uh, so there's a shift that is required, which is the planning mindset, where you need to start. So thinking, where will this be published? Instead of thinking that where it be published, teams need to really ask, what does this content need to become across systems, platforms, and experiences? And that conversation and that thought process needs to happen from the beginning. That's the beginning of reuse thinking. This is omni-channel publishing to exist everywhere. And it's one of the foundational mindset shifts behind structured content systems. So once content leaves an owned environment, that means the platforms you own, like the rules change. So your own environment is inside your own website or your product or your platform. And there, your content still carries a lot of built-in context. Users can navigate around it. They can see surrounding pages, navigation systems, branding, supporting documentation, and relationships between the pieces of content. Easy peasy. And if something is imperfectly structured, humans are really good at filling the gap. Like, if something's not there, they're like, okay, well, I get it. I can navigate through this. But of course, platforms can't do that. And when content moves into search engines or recommendation systems, any AI interface or accessibility tools or other partner platforms, they don't have your full narrative intent. They're looking for specific things, structured things, fields, labels, and metadata, and hierarchy, and relationships, and permissions. And if those things are inconsistent or incomplete or unclear, the system really has a much harder time understanding what the content actually is, how trustworthy it is, and how it should be used. And that's a core platform problem. If a platform can't understand the content, it can't reliably surface it, adapt it, preserve it, or reuse it accordingly. So this becomes especially important because more content experiences today are partial experiences. When you think about your own experience as a consumer or a user, you're consistently finding fragments of content instead of full destinations. You'll see a preview, a summary, a snippet, a recommendation, just a recipe card, for example, generated answers, embedded experiences, or extracted sections long before you ever reach your original source. I read an article recently and then I wrote a Substack article about it subsequently, about zero-click discovery. And that phrase is about how people are not going to the final destination in order to get the content they need. It's the use of these fragments where they don't have to click. They can just see everything they need in these fragmented pieces of content. So it's really about asking, can systems understand content well enough to move it safely across environments? And this is what this visual is trying to represent. As content travels outward, it passes through three important gates. First, can I read it? Can the system identify the important pieces clearly enough to interpret the content? Second gate, can I trust it? Can the system identify authorship, source, governance, or signals of reliability? And third gate is, can I reuse it? Can the content adapt across formats, interfaces, devices, and downstream experiences without losing meaning? So it's really future facing, thinking about making sure that structure is ready for even whatever innovations will come next. So these three questions increasingly determine whether content remains visible and useful once it leaves home. So many teams are already experiencing the effects of platform dependency long before they recognize it as a structured problem. For example, like, well, in other words, the system shift has already happened. Workflows just haven't fully caught up. You usually recognize this by looking for small signs across your ecosystem. For example, maybe your content starts appearing um, uh, as these snippets, as these fragments. Maybe social platforms are automatically extracting your headlines or your descriptions. Maybe it's appearing in these ChatGPT or Claude answers. Um, and and this is happening instead of directing people to your full page. You may also see it happening operationally inside your organizations. Partners may ask for feeds or exports or APIs, structured files, or reusable content packages instead of static documents. Maybe internal teams are begin to reuse the same content source material across onboarding or product flows, newsletters, sales enablement, support systems, or even like marketing campaigns. And maybe consultants or strategists that you work with or that work with your organizations get asked to repurpose content that never was actually designed for reuse in the first place. So over time, this creates this operational complexity I mentioned before because content is reused informally, and teams start to create workarounds manually, making it super messy. And people are duplicating content in different systems, and that messes up the metadata, the governance, and so different teams end up maintaining slightly different versions of the same information across platforms. And what's important here is that these are like not isolated, annoying moments. They're actually showing that content has already become system dependent, platform dependent. And some organization may think of content primarily as web pages or those deliverables, the campaigns, but the ecosystem is already being treated is already treating it as a structured information moving between environments. So it's going to happen anyway, but you need to be in control of how that's being done. I often say that reuse is usually happening long before teams intentionally plan for it. And once that reuse starts happening at scale, structure stops being optional operationally. It becomes a necessary infrastructure so that you can control your content on platforms you own and those you don't. So you go from just creating content, managing content, and you want to preserve that clarity, that trust, that consistency and meaning as it moves across those systems and platforms outside of your internal organization. So as I mentioned before, I work with creators and content teams, and it's this sense of that they're constantly producing, they're constantly publishing, they're constantly adapting content, and somehow they're never getting ahead. I call this the treadmill effect. And there's always another format to create, another platform to update, another version to resize, and metadata to fix or something else. It's always something. And over time, that work starts feeling less cumulative and more repetitive. So, you know, it's a lot of team assume this friction is like just part of the modern publishing. It's just part of the thing that we should do, but it's not. The structure is missing, and content is tightly tied into a single. When content is tied into a single format or presentation layer, every destination requires manual translation. Um, so you end up recreating summaries and re-explaining concepts across channels, this constant redoing the same thing over and over. And that creates a workflow where effort scales linear in a linear way with very little distribution. And so the more places that content needs to go, the more operational overhead the team absorbs. And eventually your team starts optimizing around production speed instead of long-term adaptability. The goal becomes keeping up instead of building systems that reduce duplication over time. So another thing I talk about in this case is that this is the reason why content burnout becomes so common across both creator ecosystems and organizational teams. Although they're creators, they're and the other side is organization, there's still this output of content where it's people, and so burnout happens, and it's because they're compensating for the missing structure every day. And that what makes this especially frustrating is that much of the information that already exists, and so it's just not being used and structured properly. But structured content changes that relationship with your content. So instead of building from scratch for every destination, teams, creators can begin thinking in terms of reusable source content, modular components, shared metadata, and adaptable systems. And however you call it, I'm on either side. It's basically the same thing. And that shift is important because sustainable content operations are not built by increasing output indefinitely. Much of the experiences that are successful today is because the content was structured so well in the past. So this is usually the point when teams start to realize that, you know, okay, this is not about the content itself. There must be something behind that. And when teams start thinking about the destination, um, and only the destination, each channel becomes its own separate production workflow. And when content is planned primarily around individual destination, then of course duplication is going to happen. And what's interesting is that a lot of organizations interpret these problems as communication or resource problems. Oh, we need more people, or we need more SOPs, but it's actually modeling problems. Reuse first planning starts from a different assumption. So the assumption should be, why does this content need to become? What does this content need to become across these systems and experiences? So, um, you know, now the focus moves from upstream. It moves upstream towards reusable source content, modular components, metadata, governance rules, audience variations. In reused first systems, content isn't um, is not the finished page, but the structured source material that can support many downstream experiences without requiring teams to manually output and rebuild every time. That's why this slide contrasts channel first thinking with reuse first thinking. On the left, every platform creates more operational work, as I described. Content keeps getting recreated from formatting, resized, whatever, redistributed manually. But on the right side, the system behaves differently. A structured source layer powers multiple outputs. This is the goal. The content becomes easier to adapt because the important pieces are already organized and structured intentionally. This is a deliberate action. And so this reuse thinking is something that you means that you're designing it into the content from the beginning. So at this point, when people hear content model, they imagine something extremely technical or heavily tied to a CMS implementation. When I first heard it, that's what I thought. But one of the best ways to think about a content model is just like as an agreement about what type of content it actually is. A content model defines what pieces matter, what those pieces mean, how they should behave as content moves across systems and experiences. And so without that shared structure, reuse becomes very risky very quickly. And without that shared understanding, different teams interpret information differently. I talk about this shared language from a human perspective a lot as well, because there's assumptions that happen, context disappears. And so when the team members leave to do their separate work, metadata becomes inconsistent and all the things I described that happen with the content. So a clear content model prevents that drift. It creates consistency not by flattening out the content, but by clarifying the role each piece plays within the larger systems. And this, of course, applies far beyond food publishing. An event listing might include a title or location, accessibility information, audience, speaker details, etc. A product education article may include summaries, eligibility requirements, disclaimers. Research insight might include evidence sources, review dates, contributors, but each type of content carries meaning through its structure. That's why content models are so important operationally. They help organizations preserve meaning as content moves across these teams and channels and interfaces and these downstream systems. And when I say downstream systems, I mean the things that haven't happened yet, the platforms that don't exist yet, the experiences that are yet to be innovated. So the example I show here is intentionally simple. It represents a reusable expert insights object. Instead of it existing as one large unstructured block of text, the information is broken into meaningful components that you see here. And what's important is that each field carries context with it, and structure makes it reuse safer because systems and teams can understand not only what the content says, but how it should be interpreted and where it could appropriately appear now and into the future. And in many ways, content models are where editorial thinking and systems thinking meet. And they help preserve the voice, the meaning, the governance, the adaptability simultaneously, all at the same time. And as content ecosystems become more connected, that shared understanding becomes increasingly important. So metadata is one of those things that many content teams know that they're supposed to do. Creators too. Creators, especially in food, they use a lot of plugins for their recipes. So they know all about metadata, at least from conceptually, but very few people are excited about doing it. It's especially for creatives, it feels like administrative work because it is. They have to fill in the tags, do the alt text, complete the fields, check the boxes, do all that stuff. It's not like the funnest thing in the world. But one of the biggest mindset shifts in structured content is realizing that metadata is so important for communication. It's how systems understand what your content is, who it's for, where it came from, how current it is, and how it can safely move around across these platform experiences. And in many ways, metadata functions like a travel documentation for content. I love to travel. I have a passport. I never leave home without it. So when content enters each system, partner ecosystems or accessibility tools or other places, these systems really rely heavily on metadata signals to interpret what they're receiving. So discovery metadata helps systems understand how content should be surfaced. So things like titles, descriptions, keywords help platforms connect content to the right people in context. It's how people discovering today. Metadata is heavily used for discovery today. So trust metadata becomes increasingly important as ecosystems become more automated. Information like author attribution, which is huge in the creator space, source links, review dates, and provenance help systems and audience evaluate reliability and credibility. So reuse metadata helps organizations govern how content can travel, like rights, licensing, restrictions, expiration rules, usage permissions. And these become really important once content starts moving across partner and downstream platforms. So while metadata feels like invisible or heavy, it really plays a visible role in discoverability and accessibility and trust and all the things that I mentioned. And it's the system language, it's the language system used to understand content better. One of the fears that I hear in conversations that I'm eavesdropping on or people share with me is that they think that structure will make things be very generic. And once content becomes modular, reusable, and systemized, it somehow loses its humanity. And I understand that concern. I've been in the food space, and I feel like that's one of the most human things that we have. As I mentioned to Paula at the start of the session, food. Everyone has a food story. Recipes. Whether you're an expert chef or just a beginner, we all have that same thing that kind of brings us all together. And, for content strategists, designers, or editors, or, your work really depends on nuance, tone, storytelling, and emotional connection. But in practice, excuse me, but in practice, the problem is there's structure without, excuse me, structure without, sorry, pause for a second. All right, guys. Structure without that editorial intention. Um, so so without structure, your voice becomes surprisingly fragile. Content gets reused across platforms and rewritten by different teams, summarized by systems, adapted into new format, and that really changes the tone. Your message is drifting, the meaning changes, and the nuance gets flattened out. So structure helps protect against that. So it's actually the opposite of what people think it is. Um, and so structure can really help organizations preserve not only what content says, but how it should feel and how it should be interpreted. That's why I wanted this visual to show um, Shay, that's who I call her, um, of working across cross-functionally with engineering and product teams. Because protecting voice increasingly requires collaboration between editorial thinking and systems thinking. Um, so, it's so structure is not the opposite of voice. It's how voice survives reuse. And I have no voice for some reason right now. So structure does not remove the humanity of content. It really helps meaning, tone, trust, and intent to remain intact as content travels farther than it used to. So one of the reasons I use recipes a lot, as I mentioned, is because it's inherently structured. A recipe naturally creates has a lot of reusable parts. The title, the ingredients, the steps, the yield, the dietary information, and they're modular by nature. And because of that structure, the same recipe can move across different environments. When I first started engaging with the content community, I realized that the recipe was used as an example a lot in structured content, but often I was the only person in food tech even in attending or in the room, virtually or in person, which I think is kind of funny. Um, but you a single recipe might appear on the blog, inside search results, on Pinterest, in a grocery app, on a smart recipe device. And what makes this movement possible is not the quality of the recipe itself, like how good it is or how effective it is when the home cook makes it, but the structure supporting it, the schema, the metadata. And so this example, it transcends across food. It's really about making your content machine readable and reusable, partner ready, and adaptable across systems. So in content strategy, of course, you can apply that. A recipe ingredient list is not that different from product specifications or structured requirements. Recipe steps function a lot like procedural instructions or onboarding flows. Dietary tags behave really similarly to audience segmentation or eligibility labels. And the recipe card functions like reusable content object. Syndication partners consuming recipes are not fundamentally different from downstream platforms consuming enterprise content. So the underlying logic is super similar. That's one of the reasons recipes appear so often in these conversations ad nauseum. I've heard people are like, okay, enough with the recipe. Let's think of something else because it's just so easy to use. And but fundamentally, it when recipes move across these systems, um, recipes just happen to make that ecosystem visible in very intuitive ways because of that structure. So while the examples and visuals you see come from food and creative ecosystems, the large lesson is really broader. Content is that is clearly structured becomes easier to understand, to reuse, to adapt, and ultimately easier to sustain over time. And as content becomes more portable, of course, another challenge appears, which is preserving authorships, attribution, and context as content moves across systems. Like this has been a big problem, especially with the rise of Gen AI. Especially for content creators or people who or content forced organization, the very strong emotional words coming from the content being used and appearing in platforms they don't own without their control. A lot of people use the words like theft or slop because to describe this, unauthorized use of their content. But visibility alone, this shows visibility alone is not enough. Content can travel very far while gradually losing important pieces of information along the way. So a quote might survive, but the source disappears. The attribution is gone. A summary could surface, but the original context becomes unclear. You don't, and that can really change semantic meaning. And an AI generated response references the information without preserving where it came from or how current it is. We've learned that as well. So once that context is detached, trust becomes harder to maintain. This is one of the reasons provenance and stewardship are becoming increasingly important topics in content strategy and publishing systems, and as it should be. So that's what this context chain visual is trying to represent here. As content moves outward into search systems, AI experiences, partner platforms, and connected systems, all these things need to stay attached. Authorship, source information, rights, review status, governance, approval rules. And this is why metadata is so important to support that. But the good news is that structure can help protect against fragmentation. So if you have clear attribution, metadata, source URL, licensing information, provenance fields, governance rules, it really helps content retain its identity as it moves between environment. Uh, because if content is going to travel widely, that's what you want, and increasingly it will with or without your deliberate work. Then attribution and usage rules will need to travel with it. So those need to be embedded in the content. Otherwise, visibility becomes very fragile very quickly. So one of the biggest shifts I hope people take away from this conversation is that structured content is not about operational efficiency. Um, Stewardship is the most important thing because the moment content becomes portable, reusable, and understandable across systems, as it is today in modern publishing, it becomes something that needs to be more durable. It starts functioning less like a temporary post or a temporary piece of content in your organization and more like long-term intellectual property. So a lot of organizations and creators are still approaching publishing as though content exists mainly for immediate distribution. We need to stop thinking that way. Not thinking about like it's just for this campaign or this launch window or this engagement spike or the algorithm moment trying to go viral. But if the content has value, which it inherited, it has value once it's created, it will continue to move along long after the original publication event is over. And it gets syndicated across different partner ecosystems, referenced in search materials, adapted into product flows. And then the goals of the organization will become realized through monetization and other opportunities. So, and when that content starts to move more widely, our organizations also need ways to preserve ownership, attribution, governance, and trust. That's why licensing and structure are becoming more connected conversations. Licensing doesn't just begin with legal paperwork. It begins with the organization, and then being able to clearly identify what the content is, who created it, who it's from. I think you're seeing a pattern through the structure. And without that structure, content becomes difficult to govern at scale. So what's important is that this applies far beyond creator economies or media publishing. Any organization producing reusable knowledge is increasingly managing intellectual property ecosystem. That's why I feel like I wanted this slide to feel more optimistic than defensive. The point is that it's not simply protecting content from misuse. It's about the fact that structured content gives long-term value. It's an asset because it allows good work to remain connected, attributable, reusable, and adaptable over time. And ultimately, structured content helps organizations build systems where effort compounds instead of always disappearing, and you have to start the work all over again. And that's why your content, anyone's content, the organization's content is more than just a post or an editorial entity. It's part of a larger knowledge ecosystem that continues changing long after it's published. So as content ecosystems continue evolving, I don't think the future belongs to the teams creating the most content. I think it belongs to the teams creating content that can move, adapt, and remain meaningful across ecosystems. And because I'm passionate about food tech, I think it will continue to change and improve the future of cooking. And content is no longer experienced in one place or space, one format or one interface. It moves between these platforms. And that means the real challenge is we're not simply publishing content anymore. We are preserving meaning, trust, authorship. And that's why structured content is really important right now. And so I think, and with that, I thank you all so much for spending time with me today. I really appreciate the opportunity to share this conversation with the community, especially because spaces like this really played such a big role in my own professional growth. So you can connect with me anywhere and everywhere, and feel free to reach out on all these places and via email. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Sandy. Really terrific. We've got a few questions that came in the chat, so Tony is going to queue those up. If anyone, if the conversation sparks any other questions, please put those in the chat as we start going through these.
Absolutely, and thank you, Sandy. We do have a few questions, and I see a couple more coming in too. So first one's from Joe. How are content models stored or documented if they don't live in a CMS or a CCMS? So say your CMS or a CCMS doesn't support structured content very well. What do you do?
I think there's so many more solutions out there. That's one of the reasons why I'm bringing more awareness or just talking to different people. Like, I would assume the people in these conversations or these meetups, we know a lot about these things, these CMSs and things like that, but there's a lot of adjacent industries, like they don't know anything. I work with a lot of content creators and I do some consultations with them. And in one of my Substack articles, it was, what if your blog disappeared tomorrow? And and a lot of people are not even aware of the possibility of something happening or even that their WordPress is a CMS. So I think education is important to make sure that people understand what a CMS is and what it does and what it doesn't do. So I think if you're, um, educating yourself about the features of, your CMS. Is it just a holding content, or is it making it adaptable and structured so that it can continue to work for you? So that would be my answer to this. If you're listening to this and it doesn't have structure, go find one that does. That helps you with that.
Excellent. Great. Thank you. Next question is from Joe Goldner. And Joe, if you would like to unmute yourself and ask a question, I think a question about different projects, different content models.
Yeah. Okay, let me find it. What did I put? What did I put up there? Oh yeah. Yes. Well, hi, Sandy.
Hi.
Um, in your project experience, I guess this is just pushing or drilling in on the physical form used. This might be related to the preceding question. Physical form used to express the content model. So, literally, what language, what ways do you find in your current projects the most attractive for expressing the model? Obviously, to marking up or structuring the content, and representing the metadata. Now, that may, yeah,
Mm.
munch them all together.
Yeah, so I think I told this story when I was at Convex recently, and about the first time I heard about JSON markup language. And I thought it was a person. It's like, who is this person? Why are they the MVP? I don't get it. I think when you talk about, because most people who are on content teams, they're not software engineers, they don't really code. So but in my content team, it was a really short bridge to understand, the context, probably because we were in food. We were using, JSON language, with to create the product matching, for example, from an ingredient database into a shoppable cart. So I think and what we were working with was a proprietary CMS. The company had built a CMS from scratch, but I think the model could look like whatever you needed to. We used like JSON. We used a certain database for that. So it's I think even WordPress recipe plugins, they have a feature where you can export JSON, which a lot of creators don't know about. And maybe they don't need to use it, but just understanding that why it's there. When you're working with tech platforms, for example, if your metadata and everything is in your CMS and you can export to JSON, for example, that really is a powerful opportunity for your content to be in new platforms and to leverage that asset when you're trying to do new things. So I don't know if that answers your question really, but I think that is how it answered it.
Oh, yeah, that works. That works. Cool. Yeah. And I think I had a second question, being greedy. Um, Back to your experiences, you have experiences where what should have been portable turned out to not be portable. So suddenly you ran into a brick wall out there that wasn't quite what you were expecting.
Definitely. I think I remember working with a meal kit company that's now defunct. And a lot of the companies that I work with as clients in the past, they wanted to digitize their recipe content. And this came up. I thought, sometimes you think these are things only happening in your organization. And then when you hear everybody else happening, that dreaded PDF, you have these content pieces, and the journey of content. We went from books and magazines and the PDF. And so I was working with this meal kit company, and they had thousands and thousands of recipes on these PDFs, and they wanted us to ingest them, which is an overused word, oversimplified word, ingest them, and then add them into the ANAP format. And it was a complete disaster, because there was no way to do that without a lot of manual work, and it wasn't like the best experience, because it wasn't made for that. The content wasn't structured properly, and so we had to. It was Scotch tape and prayer, and it was this really wonky Excel spreadsheet thing, and it was really bad, and yeah, it was not good.
Excellent. Thank you, Sandy, and thank you, Joe. Next question is from Hannah, and kind of touches on Sandy, something you just mentioned about content folks kind of, sort of needing to know how to code a little bit. Do you feel content designers are becoming more like system designers?
I've heard this question asked or spoken about in the past. I think I think it's important that content designers or anyone in content really continue to own being content evangelists. But I also speak about this shared language, really trying to understand so you can speak to, creating the impact and the experience that you need to. So, when I was learning or hearing at these meetings, hearing about all this code, I didn't know what was going on. So I couldn't really use my content experience to make an impact. So I had to do a little education. It was just 101. I didn't really go back past that, just so I knew what was going on. I don't think you have to become, a systems person, but you certainly need to know the fundamentals so that you can speak their language. I work with some incredible engineers in China, but they couldn't cook. They couldn't cook. So I had to, and I'm certainly not going to take them, and teach them how to cook. No, I have to bridge the gap, and I kind of speak the language just enough to do to guide the organization to the goal that they need. So I think we can still keep our identities as content designers or content strategists or whatever it is, but just it's like 2.0, which is I also know what when I look at adjacent code, I know what I'm looking at, and I can talk to you about it.
Excellent. Cool. Thank you. And if anyone else has additional questions, just drop them in the chat. We had a question from Francis, and actually it's a two-parter, and you might end up answering the second part in the first. But first part, what structured authoring tool are you using? And two, how has AI affected your workflow?
I'm not personally using a structured authoring tool, but I think my workflow, I use a lot of tools that have added AI features, in recent years, which, I'm like a lifer. So when I, get tools, I tend to use them for a long time. I don't like a lot of change, but I will say that there's a lot of like the tools that I use, like just for productivity. Now I'm running my own business, and I work with companies that are using AI in different ways, or other LLMs in different ways. I think that how it's changed is that now I'm talking to organizations or when I work with platform teams about, really not just really taking ownership and control over it. Don't just like let AI go and just do whatever it wants. Really understand the impact that it has. Like I have a AI usage policy on my website. And I wrote it last year. I need to update it again because things keep changing. I think that's different, because I'm very transparent about the fact that I use, AI, but we're all still learning about, the implications of AI too, especially because I work with creators. It's really important that I'm transparent about that, whatever that means. But I think, yeah, I think that's how it's impacted. Like we're talking about it more. There's a lot more discoverability, discovering like the process of using AI and really making, when I work with companies, making sure that the way they're using AI is intentional, deliberate, and they're educated on the impact that it makes, which is a conversations I never had to have before with companies.
Cindy, I have a question for you. It's a kind of, yeah, as we were chatting before we started, I mentioned that I'm sort of a keen home cook and consumer of all kinds of food blogs, including a
Yeah.
lot of international cuisines, right? So I'm
Yeah.
curious about, you said you work with the content creators sometimes. You consult directly with the content creators, and I'm curious, just, I mean, maybe this is kind of maybe your opinion or kind of what advice you would give when they're creating content that, even if, the recipes that I am accessing are in English, but they may be using the British terms for ingredients, or they may be using ingredients that are, typical in another country. So, I mean, this happened to me just today. I was looking for, well, one quick example would be, I might be searching for an eggplant recipe, but the recipe uses the word aubergine, right?
Yeah.
Um, or today, I knew that I'd gotten an ingredient and I had forgotten what recipe I bought it for. And so I was searching through the recipe app that I use, and it wasn't coming up because I was using, the language specific version of that term. So I had to do a little bit more digging to actually find that recipe. So I'm curious, like when is that, what's your advice in terms of when people are creating content, whether that's handled in the metadata, or, I could see that it would be, it might kind of break the authority or the authenticity of a recipe creator's culture, or content, if where they would typically use, the local term or their term, and they're, putting in, a term that might be more commonly known. Sorry, I'm not asking this very well, but I'm curious kind of what your thoughts are on that particular problem.
I completely understand what you're saying. So yeah, so it's tough out here for content creators because they were told for years, when the SEO boom happened, it wasn't called structure. It was called SEO. That's how they understand structure. And so the plugin said, oh, if you want your recipes to be discovered, do on-page SEO, do, back-end tech SEO, and all these plugins on WordPress. They did all these things to help with the discoverability of the content. And that's still the case. But what's happened is, one creator said to me recently that, they were told to do all these things and AI has used it against them because they really did structure their content properly. But then now their content is getting scraped by these, things and making it reappear in other places. My advice is always, the plugins is really what's creating the structure behind the scenes. It's the engine that's doing all the work. Now, for creators, what they don't realize is this is all the things that's happening and been talking about in the content strategy communities and all these content disciplines. It's just called something different. And if the metadata is in there properly, then localization can happen properly too. So the reason why you weren't able to see aubergine or coriander or whatever it was is because the metadata wasn't in there properly. Because these LLMs, AI, whatever, they can understand. They like, oh, when somebody in the UK is, like finding the recipe, or someone in Spain or whatever, in China, it can be localized and translated properly, if the right metadata is there. So there's a lot of fields that they skip, and I tell them not to skip it, because then it's going to pull the recipes, and then that context is going to be lost. That attribution is going to be lost because they don't know that that recipe belongs to that creator, and they don't know that that eggplant should be aubergine in that case. So I always say fill it out. And a lot of these newer plugins, they mention all the technical things that the plugin allows them to do, but they don't really understand what all those things mean. They're only thinking about a very small portion of that content. And that could be good for now. They still get sponsorships and they get those things. But when we talk about the future of cooking and consumer experiences, all the work they're doing around their structure is going to help them for new experiences into the future. So that's what I always, I'm future, looking. There's many SEO experts out there and other things, sponsorship experts. That's not me. I'm talking about, hey, let's get yourself ready for whatever's coming next. So that's what I would say.
Okay, thanks. Looks like Joe has a follow-up takeaway there that you may want to.
Don't get started on food. Then it's just like,
right.
It just goes crazy.
we can get off the food and back onto input for platforms and generative engine optimization. But I'll let you, Joe, you can just read your question or ask it.
Yeah, I guess it's I've really enjoyed this, Sandy, and over decades I always look for new takes on a debate we've been having since the
Mm.
80s. But in this case, where my mind went when you were speaking, I was sort of grabbing some of your sound bites, which I just love. Like they're sort of fresh and very memorable. And I'm going to take a run at trying to make one of my own, like a structure and metadata first strategy, like saying, and I've found this in often really big distributed or multi content management systems. So we have many content management systems that if we think about the structure and the metadata first, they become a prompt for good content. So it's almost like we talk about doing it with our chatbots. We talk about our content being a structured content as a prompt for the engine. But in this case, the prompts can be sort of a poke to get good content. And I found that, say, particularly my background is like more technical, like big technical, ugly manuals and stuff, that if you pass a request to someone saying very clear, how do we fix this specific thing in this particular context on a rainy Tuesday? Then the said engineer will go on at length because you gave them a great prompt. They knew exactly what they were writing about. And then you can just see in your model that micro content was one of the phrases we used to use. It then can go and it's like it's got that context built in. And I loved it, and I retweeted it within this space, the idea of built-in context. That's a good way to see our structure. Anyway, I'm just sort of seeing whether I've just wandered into insanity, as I often do.
That's an excellent observation. I like that. Anything that helps people create better content. All right. Any other final thoughts, questions, insights? Thank you, everybody, for joining us. Thank you so much, Sandy. This was a really terrific presentation.
Really nice. Thank you.
Yeah, we love having you. And everyone who's still here, keep an eye, as I mentioned, on our Slack and website and all those places to be informed about our upcoming events, and hope to see you at one of those. We will post the video from this soon. We'll let you know when it's up. All right. Yes, and July happy hour if you are local. Or, Portland's not that far away, Sandy.
I know I may crash.
All right. Okay. Good night, everyone. Thank
Good
you.
night. Bye.
Bye.